You've seen them, right? Every election season, you're driving around and these little campaign signs pop up on lawns and street corners. And you probably wonder, who are these people? What's their story? Well, today we're diving deep into one of those stories. It's a political journey that doesn't start in a law firm or a state house, but on a Hollywood soundstage. This is all about Krystee Clark's run for Los Angeles City Council.
So, picture this. It's 2017. You're at a candidate forum in some church hall. And that quote you see? That was Krystee Clark's battle cry. It was this incredibly potent anti-establishment message that just immediately cut through the noise. Right away, you knew she wasn't just another politician. She was declaring a fight.
Which, of course, brings us to the big question. How in the world does someone go from acting on TV shows to trying to take down the political machine in one of the biggest cities in America? What's the playbook for an outsider like that? To really understand her campaign, we've got to go back, because this is not your typical political origin story. It's a journey that literally starts with scripted lines and ends with this totally unscripted, raw passion for her own community. For decades, Krystee Clark was a face you'd see on TV. I mean, you might remember her guest starring on Saved by the Bell, or popping up in a dozen other shows from that era. That's a long, successful career in a really, really tough industry. And, it probably gave her a certain kind of toughness that she'd end up using in a completely different arena.
What's so cool about this timeline is you can see the evolution so clearly. In the 90s, she's on TV sets. But then, look at the shift. By the 2000s, she's putting down roots, homeowner, volunteer. That leads right into her first city council run in 2013. And by 2016, boom, she's the president of her local neighborhood council. It's a perfect map of her journey from performer to public servant. And this is where her political identity really gets forged. It wasn't in some backroom deal. It was at community cleanups and local meetings. She found her political voice, a really powerful one, by just becoming this fierce advocate for her own backyard. So, what exactly is a neighborhood council? Well, in Los Angeles, they're this pretty unique form of grassroots government. They're elected officials, but their job is to advise. They're supposed to be the direct voice of the community, telling the big shots at City Hall what's actually going on in their neighborhoods. For Clark, this was the perfect launchpad. And this wasn't just about showing up for a few meetings to get her name out there. I mean, look at this. She was truly a part of the community fabric, reading to kids, supporting local arts, helping out at an animal rescue. She wasn't some distant political figure. She was a neighbor. And that's a kind of credibility you just can't buy. And this is the moment her advocacy just boils over. As the neighborhood council president, she goes right downtown to City Hall and basically lays down the law. She wasn't asking for permission to speak anymore. She was demanding to be heard. This quote just perfectly captures that frustration of a whole community feeling ignored, and she became the voice of it. Okay, so all of that passion, all that grassroots support, it all builds up to her running for the LA City Council itself, not just once, but twice. And this is where the story takes a really fascinating and honestly kind of puzzling turn. Okay, let's just park here for a second and stare at these numbers, because this is the central mystery. In her first run back in 2013, she gets a very respectable 1,631 votes. That's almost 11% of the vote. For a first-time candidate, an outsider, that's a really solid showing. It proves she had a real base of support. But then, fast forward 4 years, after becoming more involved, more of a leader, her vote share just collapses to just over 1%. What on earth happened here? This is the puzzle at the very heart of her story. So this is the multi-million-dollar question, right? She was a more experienced, more vocal, arguably a much stronger candidate in 2017. So why did the numbers go in the completely opposite direction? Well, it turns out there are a couple of key factors that help explain this political paradox. First, let's look at what she was saying. This slide lays out the contrast perfectly. In 2013, her platform was pretty broad. Fiscal responsibility, public safety, kind of standard stuff. But by 2017, she had sharpened that message into a spear. It was a singular, fiery focus, fighting for the little guy against the developers and the establishment. A more passionate message, for sure, but maybe one that appealed to a smaller, more specific slice of voters. Second, and this is probably the biggest factor, just look at the field in 2017. A whopping 20 candidates jumped into this race. You can see on the chart how that just carved up the vote into tiny slivers. All that anti-establishment energy wasn't just split. it was shattered. And this is a classic political trap, what you might call the outsider's paradox. The more popular an anti-establishment message becomes, the more outsiders it attracts to run, which ends up diluting the very power it was trying to build. So, what happens when the votes are all counted and you lose? For a lot of people, that's where the story ends. But for Krystee Clark, it was really just the beginning of a whole different chapter. And this might be the most important takeaway of all. Instead of just fading away, she went right back to doing the work. The election loss didn't kill her passion for public service. If anything, it seemed to fuel it. She proved that her motivation was never just about getting a title. So how do you lead when you don't actually hold the office? Well, this slide basically lays out her new playbook. Step 1, dive right back into the neighborhood council. Step 2, become a budget advocate, getting deep into the weeds of city spending. And Step 3, act as a community watchdog, hosting forums and keeping the pressure on the very people who beat her.
5 years later, another election comes around. But this time, she made a really calculated strategic move. She saw another outsider candidate getting into the race, so she decided not to run, specifically to avoid that 2017 disaster of splitting the vote. It was a pretty selfless move, putting the community's chances ahead of her own ambition.
So after following this whole journey, what's the big picture here? What can her story teach all of us about local politics and what it really means to be an engaged citizen?
Her journey is just such a powerful lesson. It shows that while grassroots platforms like neighborhood councils can be an amazing launchpad for new voices, outsiders still face these massive hurdles. But maybe the biggest lesson of all is this one. In the long marathon of civic life, losing an election isn't the finish line. Real success can be measured by your long-term impact on the community you care about.
And that leaves us with this final thought to chew on. Krystee Clark never got the title of councilwoman, but by staying in the fight, by continuing to serve, and by forcing the people in power to listen, did she actually win something else entirely? It really makes you ask, what does victory actually look like when it comes to serving your community?